Thank you all and welcome to SSP's very first Ask the Experts panel. We're very pleased you could join us today for our discussion with data scientists and others who work with data. My name is Ben Mudrak. I'm a co-chair of the SSP Education Committee this year and a product manager at the American Chemical Society. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. As you may have noticed, everyone's been muted automatically, but please use the questions feature on GoToWebinar. That'll allow you to communicate with the moderator and the panelists. The one and only agenda item today is to cover whatever questions you have, so do not be shy about participating. We're also recording the session, so all registrants will receive a link to the recording afterward. At the conclusion of today's discussion, you'll also receive a post-event evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback to help us shape this series and other future SSP programming. It's my pleasure now to introduce our moderator for today, Phil Jones. Phil is the owner and principal consultant at Double L Digital, which is a research, technology, and management consultancy. He works with publishers, startups, institutions, and funders on a broad range of strategic and operational challenges. He's worked in a variety of senior and governance roles, often with a focus on technology and data, at places such as Jove, Digital Science, and Emerald. Phil is a member of the Researcher to Reader Advisory Board, the Learned Publishing Editorial Board, is a scholarly kitchen chef, and serves on the SSP Annual Conference Organizing Committee. In a former life, he was a cross-disciplinary research scientist at the UK Atomic Energy Authority and Harvard Medical School. So I'm going to toss it over to you, Phil.
Thank you, Ben, and welcome to everybody who is joining us today. I see that we have a pretty good number of attendees, so that's really good to see. I hope that you're all staying safe and keeping well in these difficult times. Today's event is a somewhat new format for SSP and for me personally, and for the rest of our panelists. I'm not sure if we should call it a webinar, a virtual round table, or a GoToMeeting panel, although the way that everybody's talking about video conferencing today, I think we'll all be calling these things Zooms, irrespective of what technology we're using. Same way that we talk about Googling things when we mean internet searches. But speaking of technology, the theme for today's discussion is going to be data and data science. Given the breadth of knowledge and expertise that our panelists have, I wouldn't be surprised if during the course of the hour, we venture a little into some adjacencies, perhaps into metadata, research evaluation, scholarly communication infrastructure, the effect of the current situation on how we work, or even what we know about COVID-19 and the data exhaust of the pandemic. We're looking for lots of interaction, as Ben said, so please do take the opportunity to type questions into the question box of GoToMeeting. That's the preferred channel. There's also a chat box, which I'll try to keep an eye on as well. When I do read out questions, if you'd like me to say who you are and where you work, please indicate that in the question. If you don't, I'll assume that you want to remain anonymous. Speaking of experts, I'd like to now introduce you to the panelists. Mariette Demond is the Director of Research at AAAS. Dr. Demond has been conducting nationwide behavioral research studies for the past 30 years. She has experience developing and managing large data sets for statistical analysis of various types. She has specialized skills in community-based research, health behavior research, program evaluation, market research. She has directed multi-level behavior research projects for the American Red Cross, the Center for Disease Control, and the NIH. She's also an adjunct professor of psychology and sociology at the University of Maryland Global Campus. Anne Michael is Chief Digital Officer at PLOS, charged with development and execution of the data, technology, operational, and overall digital strategy. Anne was CEO of DeltaThink for more than a decade, where she gained broad exposure to society and commercial scholarly publishers, librarians, library consortia, funders, and researchers. Anne is an ardent believer in data-informed decision-making and was instrumental in the 2017 launch of the DeltaThink Open Access Data and Analytics tool. She is a past president of SSP, a member of the Learned Publishing Editorial Board, a fellow chef, and of the Scholarly Kitchen blog. Dr. Suja Thomas, last but by no means least, is an expert data scientist and mathematician who leverages statistical and programming skills to analyze complex data sets spanning business and consumer data, as well as genomic data. She has been the lead data scientist at a number of startups, including software company Pendo in North Carolina, and recently joined ABT. She she has expertise in many analytical areas, including predictive modeling, machine learning, statistical inference, stochastic modeling, and Bayesian methods. Some of her recent work focuses on leveraging natural language processing models to automate the analysis and processing of qualitative data, including customer feedback, to derive key insights to inform the customers and the business. All right, so we'll now get on to some questions. Like I say, we want to be mostly focused on the questions that you, the attendees, have, but I'd like to start off with a little bit of a kickoff question and give everybody just a few short minutes, all of the panelists, to give a brief, perhaps 3-minute summary of what they think data science is to them and what their thoughts are perhaps on where data science has been going in the last 5 years and perhaps what might be on the horizon. So why don't we start with Anne? Anne, as CDO at PLOS, you must think a lot about data and strategic decisions surrounding it.
Sure, absolutely. So at PLOS, we're actually in the middle or at the beginning of a very large project to re-architect our entire data infrastructure. And when I think about where data science has been and where it's going, I think the first word that comes to my mind is democratization. So it used to be that data and data science, and especially when you think about big data, was the realm of the few and the elite, probably like Suja, who has, I'm sure, very, very deep skills in the identification, cleaning, management, and analysis of data. But what's happening is more and more, thank God, people are starting to not use data only in an episodic fashion when they do a strategic plan or they're launching a new product or they want to understand what's happening in a particular market, and they're starting to use it in the regular course of making decisions. They use data for operations, they use data for just strategic decision making, and then finally starting to use data to predict, starting to build models and go even farther than that. And all of those things are made possible by a lot of the tools that we'll talk about today that have made it a lot easier for people that don't have the intense computational and mathematical skills that a true data scientist has. I am not a true data scientist, just want to say that right up front. You know, but it lets the rest of us try to help a business or organization understand what can you do with data that's going to help you every single day and when you launch products and want to understand your audiences.
Excellent, thanks, Anne. So let's continue on that vein. And Marietta, so can you tell us a little bit about how you work with data, or perhaps around the work that you do at AAAS, as well as some of the other organizations like CDC and NIH?
Yes, so for AAAS, our issue primarily is that we have, like I think a lot of large organizations, we have a lot of data, but they are in different formats in different places around the organization, being developed and used for different purposes. And in our sort of department of research, we're trying to find a way to normalize and unify that data so that we can answer bigger questions. And part of what we're finding in our research department is that old methodologies like distributing online surveys where you get small response rates and you get self-report data are really not as good as actually going to the data. We have data right now, for example, people that go to sciencemag.org to look at Science magazine articles, where we can track in detail who is reading what the content is, when they come to read, from what sites they come, all of that type of information. So we no longer have to ask people those questions. We have the data. The trick is combining all of the data so that we have the characteristics of our readers, that we have the descriptions of what they do, that we have the patterns of when they come, when they don't come. It's normalizing all of that in a way that we can answer those questions in a competent way. And that's what we are in the process of doing at AAAS right now, because we're in the process of developing a data lake and cleaning and normalizing our data. And again, I think it's from what Anne said, there are tools available now, technology that's available now, that even just a few years ago, we did not have easy access to, that would not have allowed us to use all these data points this way. So that's what's made us excited about using data.
Excellent, so lots of opportunities there. So
Yeah.
Suja, so coming from more of a startup-oriented background, perhaps, what do you see as the cutting edge that's on the horizon?
So it's really interesting. A lot of what Marietta and Anne said, really, I want to echo in terms of what I think is going to be cutting edge. I think one of the properties of having been at a startup is that I was present when this organization was pretty small, and data management was really not a very difficult task if you were in a group of 20 people or something like that. And I've also been with companies that have really grown very rapidly. And it's amazing how just a tripling of numbers can really lead to a rapid deterioration in how data is managed and handled. So I think just the sophistication over the last 5 years of the tools that are currently available and the ease at which you can consolidate your data and move it all into one place to make it democratic for everyone to analyze. Also to make sure that it's consistent between different departments so that when you are talking about numbers, you are actually talking about the same kinds of numbers and everyone has a common understanding. Something that I think we're going to take into the future is the power of communication about data and tools available for that, especially visualization related, but also creating reports that really enable organizations to not only make decisions, but communicate the decisions that they made and translate it to either stakeholders or customers. But what I have seen, especially within the last year and what's coming up ahead, to me is focusing a lot on security, especially as the volume of data that we can now manage is really high, and also the ethics around the data. So we have a ton of talent inside the workforce around managing, analyzing big data and applying the sophisticated packages that now exist. But now I think we're at this really interesting stage of we can see the results. Do we believe the results? What should we be watching out for? What should we be keeping in mind about the kinds of data that we are giving it? Have we spanned the spectrum of all of our customer base? Do we have to worry about representations of different demographics, ethics? So I think in the future of the next few years, I think we have less worry about what kinds of resources we have available at our fingertips and more space and time to focus on in the kinds of data that we are seeing. Do we really have all the data available to complete our picture of what's out there in the world?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one of the things that I want to pick up on there is you talked about the kinds of tools that people have available, which can make data analysis, the visualization of data, the extraction of information value from the data a lot more accessible. And I think a lot of things one of the questions that many of our audience members may have is, how do they, perhaps they're at an organization that isn't large enough to have a data scientist or isn't large enough to have a data science core or group, perhaps they don't have experience in it. What are the sorts of approaches that people can use to kind of get started? You know, what's the low-hanging fruit? How can you access this rich vein of information and business intelligence? So why don't shall we just go straight back to you, Suja, on that, thinking about some of those tools that you were alluding to?
So the organization is a small one and does have a data scientist or at least a group of engineers who are using either open source languages or things like this. I think tools, honestly, like R and Python have amazing dashboarding capabilities. So especially something that Anne had mentioned as she was introducing herself, it used to be the case that all the data and the power of communication around the data was in the hands of the data scientist. But now I think an essential part of the job is, can I create a dashboard to allow those of my users and my stakeholders and collaborators who don't necessarily want to run my code, give them a place to play with the results of my code and see what those tables are. So you don't have to be, it's not necessarily an Excel sheet or a CSV where you say, okay, here is the data that you want to see, but I can actually provide you a dashboard tool from Python Dash or something like that, or a Shiny dashboard from R. Many organizations that I have worked with even though they were small, made the choice to invest in tools like Tableau, for example, or Domo, where you may have a modest or a really huge database, but you can connect these databases very easily to connectors, to tools like Tableau and Domo, where you don't have to write very sophisticated scripts, but you can see what the results are like, and everyone can see that in real time at the same time.
Yeah, so low code and no code type solutions for data analysis. And I see Anne nodding furiously at a lot of what Suji was saying. So I'm gonna just go ahead and just let you come in.
So Suja, you were giving me flashbacks. So last year I finished a Master's of Science in Business Analytics, and it was an accelerated program. So like in the first module, had to learn R, Python, SQL, and it went through all these, and it was, and what you're saying is so true. Like even someone myself who had never programmed in any language before, I was able to get into R to do shiny dashboards, you know, and then to get into Tableau and do stories and points. But I want to take it even a step farther. If the idea, if someone is sitting there saying, oh my God, I have to learn R, or I have to know R, like you said, first of all, the dashboard is something that can be deployed for anyone to use, and you don't need to know anything. But when you look at Tableau, Domo, Looker, a lot of these Sisense, a lot of these visualization tools, if you even have a spreadsheet that you want to play with and do more than a graph in Excel, you can pull it into these tools and you can start to see different dimensions. I mean, literally, you can start to create multi-dimensional visualizations that are really informative and help bring really the more critical points to the forefront. And they even have lots of options in there to help you declutter your graphs so that they're really easy to read. And you don't have to know R. As Suji was saying, if you do know R or Python, these tools often do allow you to add code and create variables and do things like that. But you don't have to. You can use what you feel comfortable with and then grow if you want to, or hire someone else to do it. Go get a data science when you have an idea of what are the real questions you really want to ask.
But Marietta, does this echo some of your experiences, perhaps doing you know, health behavior research? You might be working with maybe physicians or public health folks who, you know, who perhaps don't have a computer science background or a data science background, or maybe some of the work you do at AAAS, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great concern for end users. It's really what the primary request is for our office. And part of it too is we don't want to have to do everybody's reports every day. So by really what our job has been, and maybe going back a step before dashboards, is we found that what we had to start with was making sure everybody was defining data and data terms the same way. And we also discovered how many assumptions people make about data. So people will come in and ask for certain types of reports. And when you go backwards and you kind of break it all down, you realize that the way that they're defining a term in one department, like in our publishing department, might be very different than in our membership department. And people are making assumptions about where that data comes from, what it means. So the very first thing that we did was to break down all that terminology, write some good data definitions, and come up with a good data dictionary. And then we started cleaning all of and normalizing all of the variables so that we could create clean data to basically pull into these other tools. And in essence, what our job might have been 5 years ago, where we were people running SPSS on surveys and producing reports, now our job is primarily working with other departments to find out what their research questions are, being able to identify data points, clean the data points, and then pull those data points into dashboards and into the tools that they need to answer their own questions. And then once we get that set up for them, they can take it from there. And that's a huge difference in, like I said, in just a few years.
Yeah, I think that replicates a lot of the experiences that people, not just in data science, but also across a lot of the technology functions, kind of experience. That it's becoming about creating tools for people to be able to do work rather than doing the work, if you like, not quite for them, but in a direct support kind of way. So I'd like to now switch to one of the questions that's come from one of the audience members, because we do want to kind of be driven by what the attendees want to learn about. And one question that's come in is can you speak about a time when you've been an advocate for a pivot in data collection or policy at a current or a past organization? What worked well and what didn't? And this question really made me think of Anne, because I know that you did a lot of this sort of thing, particularly at Delta Think, didn't you?
Yeah, so I think it's not an uncommon thing, especially in a consulting environment, to wind up being brought into an organization with someone that may have a reasonable understanding and direction and agenda around what they want to do with data and how they want that to work, and then have the rest of the organization maybe not have that cultural understanding. So one of the things in particular, and applause that's a little different, I think that there is a value, that there's a general value across the organization about data. Getting back to, I can't remember if Mariette said this or Suja said this, we definitely have an issue that we have to work out around the idea of a data catalog, and having the same definitions. And another really fundamental thing that people need to understand when they work with data is that data is not a crystal ball, and a magic answer doesn't pop out. So when you think about fundamentally helping an organization's literacy about data increase, there are certain things that you always, and it's happened to me in many situations, that you always have to stress. I've said this a few times in public, so I apologize if anyone has ever heard me say this, but I love to quote George Box, who says, all models are wrong and some are useful. So people need to understand that data, there's no perfect representation of reality. There isn't one. There's no perfect. So what you do is you create, as Suju says, you have people understand that they're creating assumptions there, and then they have to test those assumptions, and then they might change those assumptions. So the biggest thing that I've had to work with people when they're thinking about that cultural change is to understand where and how data can fit into what they do. What are the key questions they have? AAAS is very sophisticated and I'm sure understands its key questions. But even at PLOS, we know some of them, but we don't know all of them. And you can't investigate something that you can't articulate. So, I mean, that's an interesting point to think about in a cultural change too. And then when you get an answer, when you get a model, you get a prediction, you have some information, you need to test that. It doesn't just, it's not naturally perfect and right because it popped out of a model that you created, which is based on assumptions and proxies. And I think Suja said this too. There aren't perfect models because there isn't perfect data. You're often trying to say, oh, well, I don't know this, but if I know this, this, and this, and I use them in this combination, does that reasonably get me an approximation of the thing I don't know? And so, proxy. So I think that, I don't know if that directly answered the question, I hope it did, but these are all things that I think that when you think about democratizing data and you think about getting people to use data on a regular basis, that they need to understand the limitations, the value, and the iterative nature of using data, and that there's no right answers, you still have to think.
Yeah, that is very, very true. I mean, I remember back when I was a research scientist, there was a running joke amongst physicists that an experimentalist, or beg your pardon, a theorist is someone who nobody believes their work apart from them. An experimentalist is someone who everybody believes their work apart from them. That is because when you're actually the person analyzing the data and pulling it apart and trying to fit the models to it, then you realize just how many assumptions you've had to make and how dependent those results and those predictions are on the quality of that data.
Bill, can I just add one more thing? This is real, like every month kind of a thing that I wind up going through, is that, so I work with Dan Pollock and we do a news and views for Delta Things still every month. And every month we have these debates about, well, what does this mean? And what does that mean? And is this really right? And can you represent this? And can you do it in a better way? So it's just it's an ongoing, you're always looking at your data. You're always questioning it, not just accepting it the way it is, but trying to understand what else you can pull out of it that might not show itself right away.
Yes, exactly. That's how science works. That's the fun of it. All right. So Anne asked, or wondered to the extent that AAAS understands its questions. So Marietta, how well do you understand your questions?
I will say that we're getting there, but that is the issue, isn't it? I think anywhere you go with data science, and so commonly people will come to us and say, can you give me a graph every month that'll help me make a decision about how to grow my journal, or about how to get customers that are consuming free content start to purchase content. I can't give you a graph that does that, but what I can do is usually work with you to come up with the questions you need to answer in order to do that. And I think that that's something else. Like you were saying, and there's a lot of thinking and a lot of theorizing and model building. A lot of it is just, what are your questions? How can we break that down? What do you want to know about your audience? What do you want to know about when they access information? What characteristics can we measure? We have to break all those pieces down into little tiny pieces so we can start to put them back together in order to get you answers. So and I think that can be the downside too of some of these quick tools, because I think sometimes, you know, like in our publishing department, we may have access to like Adobe Analytics or Google Analytics, and folks think that just because I can produce a whole lot of charts, then I know more about what's happening. And you don't, you know, unless you know what questions you're trying to answer, and unless you know what information you need to get you to the next level. And it can be deceiving, because I think sometimes it looks like, well, I'm using tons of data, but you might not be using the data in a way that's useful. And I think that's why it's often a team effort. That's why it often takes people with different perspectives, different backgrounds at the table. And it's the talking through, it's the questioning, it's the doubting, the wondering, all of those things that really make the data useful.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting in the way that it mirrors some of the conversations that have happened in academia, particularly in things like biology. Bioinformaticians will tell you about dynamite plots and how they, you know, are a graphical representation of the data that can be horribly misleading. You know, and you just get this kind of bar with a star above it, and it says, the p-value is whatever it happens to be, and people think that that's necessarily an answer, but there's an underlying kind of data distribution that tells a richer and more interesting story. So Suja, what are your thoughts around kind of assumptions and validity and the balance between making this accessible so that it's easy to use with a package versus making sure that we're not over-interpreting data and getting the right answers?
I'm just thinking about something that Marietta just said, which was getting people together in the same room and making sure that the assumptions are, as best as you can, universal across. I have maybe it's a simple example from one of the companies that I worked at, and it was just a question of setting what metrics the organization as a whole needed to follow, and also from those large metrics, what did individual departments themselves take down to follow as their own little metrics inside of sub-metrics inside of the big one. And it was a Net Promoter Score, the NPS metric for companies, which gives you an idea based on serving your customers, how satisfied they are with you. I'm going to completely leave aside my own assessment of what the NPS metric is like and how useful it can be. I'm sure you all have your opinion. But what was happening at the organization at the time was that people were very focused on what was happening around the metric on a quarterly basis. And when they would see large dips, it would really bother them. It would panic because it was a company-wide metric. And the pivot, so to speak, of analyzing that metric was us getting together all in the same room. And by the way, that process took 6 months from the first time that the panic set in to when we actually all got together, because these panics escalated, locally and then globally inside the company. And then we got together, and so I was part of the team, and it was nice to be able to say, look, across on a yearly basis, the fluctuation around your NPS is impacted by multiple factors. Your customer base has been growing, so has your employee base, so has your product line numbers. And so this is kind of expected. Also, in terms of just raw fluctuations, if this was a stock market, you have nothing to worry about. And so don't take a micro picture, which is of what happens every quarter, and focus just on that. So I feel like this is a simple example because it was just one metric. But the pivot that we did was to move our focus away from one slice of the view and also running experiments to actually validate these fears and these panics. If we do have a fear that our NPS has dropped, then we dig into the responses and run an experiment for the next 6 months, so that the agreement to be patient for the next 6 months was also arrived at the time that we all got together in the room and really take temperature readings, be more scientific and experimental about the process.
So before we kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about something a little bit different, there's one last question that I think is really important that's come in from one of the attendees, and it's for an organization that is just getting started around taking data more seriously and trying to use it for making decisions. What is it that somebody should do tomorrow? What's the first step? So why don't we start with, I'm going to go eeny, meeny, miny, mo, Marietta.
Okay. Well, what we decided to do, and we started actually 2 years ago on this, is the first thing we did, and gave it a scientific name because we're a scientific organization, a feasibility study. But really all the feasibility study was is we went from department to department and we started a spreadsheet of what data is each organization using. It's surprising how little we know about what actually exists within the company. So part of it is just getting an accounting of what do you collect, what do people use it for, where is it kept, what format is it in, and we just put it all in a spreadsheet so that we started right at the beginning to see what we had. And then from there, we were able to create an internal working group where we were able to start to go through that data sheet and see what we had in common, what we didn't have in common, which group was doing their stuff in a way that was cleaner than other groups, where could we make our first set of improvements so that we could start to sort of unify and organize. And it really was just starting right from the beginning that way and building up step by step.
Anne, where should somebody start? What should somebody do tomorrow?
First thing I think anybody should do, so I completely agree with Mariette that you have to know what you have, but if you actually want to start digging into what you have to see what it can do, the first thing you do is count stuff. How many submissions do I have? How many, so, and after you count things, then I think Suja was saying, you try to trend them. How are they trending over time? Just to get people used to, I mean, I'm talking about a place, and hopefully most of you do that kind of stuff already, but I think that the important thing about that is don't think that isn't using data. So I think sometimes people have this grand idea that we're going to go out, we're going to get big data, we're going to do this. Honestly, if you don't understand your company's financial data, if you don't understand data about your operation, if you don't understand what comes in and what goes out and like what happens to it in between, I mean, those are basic places to start. And the beauty of starting with the basics is that it'll start to get buy-in because those groups that don't have that data or aren't trending it or aren't trying to understand the factors that influence that, they're going to see a lot of value in that. And so then you'll be able to take a next step to be more sophisticated in what you do. And as Marietta said, to say, well, if I have questions I can't answer now, I want to know more, what data do I need? And do I have what I need? And you can grow from there. But, classic project management or even technology implementation is low-hanging fruit. Immediately do the things you can do and talk about them and show everyone there. And I have the benefit of being an organizer, so I can see some of the questions. And I just want to add to that, the user groups that usually you're going to find are interested. So obviously finance has been using data forever all the time. I'm sure depending on the organization, they could get more sophisticated in prediction. But publishing group, business, anybody's looking at business usage, those people that the publishing group is going to really be interested in data. Editorial, they want to understand how things are flowing through their group. How good are they at picking stuff? All those kinds. They're going to be interested in data too. Marketing is going to be interested in data. Who are the customers? What do they do? What's more important? Can we do A/B testing and figure out that if they react more to one thing? And then obviously senior management, anybody working on strategy is also going to be interested. So, I mean, honestly, it may be silly, but there's almost not a group in your organization that shouldn't be interested in data.
So the thing to do tomorrow is figure out what numbers you already have, basically, and start counting stuff.
Start playing with them.
Yeah.
Yep.
Suja, what are your thoughts on what people should do as the very easiest thing to do?
Honestly, it is a lot of what Marietta and Anne already said, which is what is the data? Where is it? Is it in one place? Does it need to be? And the other thing that I might add is if you are in a place where you know that you know what the data is, what you want to do with it, think a little maybe about right now about what you may want to do with it in the future so that you're not locked into a system which does not allow you to scale or to grow.
Right. So keep it simple, keep it practical, but think about future resilience and future flexibility.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So let's shift gears a tiny bit, and because there's a publisher specific question that has come in, which relates to the current circumstances that we're all dealing with. So why don't we go ahead and just kind of see if we can say anything helpful about this. And it's coming from Marianne Kalahana from Data Conversion Laboratory. And she asks if somebody could speak to the scholarly publishing supply chain. Now, the story that she tells in this question, I recognise because I have some connection to Edinburgh University, about labs being shut down, research animals being euthanized, and students transitioning to online learning. So the business of at least some universities is slowing down. But by the same token, people are at home, and the the argument goes that they've got more time to write now, so they might be actually generating more content in some way. So what are our thoughts on, what are our predictions, not having a crystal ball handy, on what's going to happen in the following months and maybe year or so around things like copy flow and how much content is we're going to have, and what the future of some of our journals might be. So why don't we start with Marietta again on this one. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and to be honest, yeah, that's a hard one to answer. In fact, we're working with a team right now to perhaps collect some data on that. I know that in the next week or so, that we're working to get a survey out to our members, and I think it's a huge group of scientists that we've been able to contact for this. To ask very specific questions about productivity, about the number of hours a week that they're able to spend on their work, how that focus has shifted, whether it was laboratory work that's shifted to writing work or other types of research work. I guess from my background, it's harder for me to speculate, more easy for me to say, let's create a research study to find out. So Anne might have more to say about it.
So why don't you go ahead then, Anne? Tell us more about it.
Well, I was just going to say
over to you.
One thing that that I'm finding interesting, and I think that PLOS is finding interesting, and I've done anecdotal querying of friends I have throughout the industry, is we're actually seeing an increase in submissions right now. And most of the people I've spoken, actually every one of the people I spoke to said that their publications were having the same situation. Maybe it's because people are at home, they can write, they have stuff to finish up, they have stuff they never did because they couldn't do. We're also hearing that people might start asking commissioning reviews where they have not been able to do that in the past. But the reality is, just like Mariette just said, and we've done some surveys and we've been starting to ask too, no one knows how long this is going to last. And the longer it lasts, the more likely that there's some kind of a flow. What I would say, and actually, the Delta thing put out the news and views this week, and it was about a little bit about how do you plan in a crisis. So you could go over to the website and it's posted if you want to see it. But and we'll have a discussion about that one next week. But what we're seeing and what we're thinking is that if it's not long and protracted, it's going to, first of all, it's going to vary by subject area. People say scholarly publishing, and they mean everything from, I don't know, social science to, medicine to science, all these different things, and all the subspecialties, they all have different realities. So I think what Mariette is saying and what we're doing is to try to gather information, the only way to go. And anyone that says, well, it's going to do this and it's going to do that, it's kind of hard to say. But submissions are up now, but I think a lot of us feel as though this goes on a little bit longer, and that's not going to be the case. And we also would probably want to look into different artifacts in the publication process Maybe don't focus so much on articles if article flow is going to be a problem, but go farther back into the workflow and start to publish things that are earlier, come up with forms of publications and article types for earlier research.
Yeah, necessity is the mother of invention, right? Now, if we fear that we may be under pressure, let's do something innovative and try and compensate for that. So Suja, I know that ABT has done some work around things like text and data mining and what sounds like sentiment analysis for social media around COVID and around the pandemic and the changes that it's having on society. So what can you tell us about the situation and what the data is telling us, if anything, about what might happen?
So on our end, we have been looking at alternative indicators of capturing sentiment, or of the public, and also specific categories of folks. So things like Twitter data analysis may be published by state governments on what's on the top of their minds, what are the top key themes, and every week for the past 3 weeks, every week those themes have been changing. Initially, it was things related to frustration around being at home. Now it's who do you trust, which is a source to trust, and it's just interesting. It's not a very sophisticated analysis. Very oftentimes it's quick, but you see terms like coronavirus or COVID-19 popping up along with mile runs or something like that. So we're seeing a lot of indicators of expression of sentiment around daily activities and also how those have been impacted. Things, of course, to do with the economy and like restaurant workers and the gig economy, for example. At the company, we have also, inspired by the Kaggle competition around the analysis of COVID-19 literature, a bunch of us participated in this challenge, but really settled very quickly on building an internal tool for researchers to query that mass of literature. It was about 46,000 articles, I think, at the most recent count, and allow them to go in and look for terms that they were most interested in. So maybe it's related to child welfare, or maybe it's related to homelessness, or maybe it is related to virus genetics. But using NLP and text mining to extract information from these bodies of text and create a tool internally for people to go in and query and see, well, if I'm interested in biomedical data, what are the organisms that are most reported inside the literature? Is that going to impact my internal projects and stuff like this? So yeah, I mean, I don't have a very clear answer of what the trend is like, but what we are really focusing on is making sure that we have a handle on the kinds of data that are available for us to analyze. And then with that data, keep an eye on things that are important to us as a company and also for our stakeholders and our projects that we're working on.
Yeah. So that touches up against some of the interesting work that various organizations have done around things like topic modeling, which has often been thought of as a way of informing editorial policy. Perhaps you might take a corpus of content and look at where are the intersections between various types of research threads, if you like, to detect emerging areas and shifts in focus, and identifying what areas and what topics and what ideas are trending, if you like, or becoming more and more impactful. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in around things like research metrics, around scientometrics, around citation mapping, and those sorts of things. So perhaps we can talk a little bit about trends in that area, about what should people be looking at in terms of, should we just still be looking at total citation counts and the sort of thing that, say, Web of Science or Scopus or even Google Scholar and Dimensions might be able to provide us with, or are there other interesting types of metrics and other interesting types of analyses that we should now be looking at, whether that's numerical or semantic, in order to better predict or better inform things like editorial strategy and content strategy and those sorts of challenges. So I just wonder, what are the panel's thoughts around those sorts of technologies and ideas? So shall I start with Anne? What's your immediate kind of thoughts about that?
So I mean, I think that the problem with metrics in general is that any one metric on its own is a very limited use. It's very, one-dimensional, no matter how wide it tries to go. The wider it goes, the less effective it often gets. So, I mean, the first thing I would say, just off the top of my head, is that you really need to be looking at all of these metrics. You need to be, and you need to be thinking about that in terms of your own organizational strategy. But the thing that occurred to me when you first started talking first was, if I was thinking about topic modeling and I was thinking about what's hot and what's not, I would actually go farther back in the food chain and look at funding. And I would look at funding by country. I'd look at funding by specialty if I could get that data. Who's funding what are the time frames on grants, because that's going to tell you, I think, a little bit more. So I guess I think Dimensions does have that kind of capability. So, something like Dimensions, where you have the capability to look at funding and you also have the capability to look at article flow and things like that. Since you probably can't necessarily always subscribe to everything, that's probably not, I have no interest in Dimensions. I'm saying that's probably, not I mean, financial. There's probably not but it's a good all-around tool that way, and probably Web of Science is that. But I mean, you got to keep that 360-degree view and then focus in on the thing that's important to your organizational strategy. What are the specifics? So I kind of have to know the questions or help you figure out what they are.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and you're right that I'm just speaking from my knowledge of Dimensions, because it's a digital science product and I used to work there. It does have that capability. One of the challenges around linking things like grants information to publications and mining, that sort of thing, is the lack of a persistent identifier for grants. There's an infrastructure shortcoming there that needs to be addressed, and there are people who are working at that. There are various kind of groups from funders and consortia and so forth who are looking at scholarly infrastructure and looking at persistent identifiers. So I hope that we're going to see some improvements around that sort of thing. If you like, an ORCID for grants, or a Crossref for grants, or a DOI for grants, or however you want to express it, interconnected with the metadata for all the other kind of outputs and inputs and so forth. So hopefully we'll see that sort of analysis becoming easier or more accessible sort of over time. So Marietta, what are your thoughts about kind of looking at trending topics, looking at hot topics, informing editorial strategy with data? What has been the experience at AAAS of that?
Well, and I have to admit, the work that I have done the last couple of years has focused more on the end user, more on the customer and the reader. So that's probably where I have more experience that I could speak on. Because we've been trying to track more and try to refine our taxonomies more for the reader that comes in, because we have free content, we have paid content, we have site license content, and we've been trying to look at different types of users. We also have news content that is informal. It's not our scientific research. Trying to track more and understand from that side as well. What are the topics that are most accessed for people that are doing research, for people that have personal interests in different topics as well. And part of, just to build on something that Anne was saying too about trying to make decisions, I feel sometimes too that a lot of what we hear from our editorial side is too, people want to kind of know what our sweet spot is, and that's kind of makes it difficult. Because you could do anything, you could add any topic, you could add anything to your repertoire if you wanted to. But part of what we've been trying to track with the data that's coming in and trying to understand our readers and our users is, kind of what is our sweet spot? What do people come to science for? What do people come to AAAS for specifically? What do we deliver that they're not getting from other delivery channels, and how can we refine that? And some of that is getting into some of the machine learning and predictive analytics, which we have not implemented yet, so I don't want to make it sound like we have. But what we would like to do is be able to track back so that individual interests a person might have, we can make better recommendations, we can send them emails, we can contact them in the topics that they're interested in. Because we are also inundated with information right now of every topic, that if there is anybody that can send me information that's important just to me and I don't have to search for it, they're actually doing me a favor. So I know that doesn't completely answer your question because I kind of turned it on its head, but that's a little bit about how, from our side, how we've been approaching content and trying to track taxonomies and trying to better serve our readers and our customers.
I think I think you did answer the question, because I think those are basically two sides of the same coin, right? I mean, if we're talking about what our editorial policy should be, then it should be informed by what do our readers want, right? What our input to the system should be, what is the output that's in demand. So I think it's very much part and parcel of the same fundamental question. It's not just about looking at one particular metric, is it? It's about informing yourself with all of the different pieces of information and data at your disposal in order to kind of synthesize a much richer decision-making process. So Suja, as an innovator in data field, what sort of thing, and perhaps looking a little bit further ahead than some of the cutting edge stuff around maybe assertion mapping or topic modeling or some of the more interesting things around that, what are your thoughts in terms of what might be possible in the future?
Wow, so I think this is a very tough prediction to make. And I'm sure that any prediction I make is probably going to be wrong. But I can say that, even topic modeling in such a vast space, scholarly publishing is incredibly challenging and very subjective. So a little project that we have taken on in the company is just creating a taxonomy of our internal resources. And a lot of that is, proposals written to organizations, which also include scholarly publications. But wow, running topic models on these and evaluating them requires collaborating with a domain expert. That involves the decision of who a domain expert is. And even things like, was this a successful proposal or not? If I extrapolate that to, is this a successful paper or not? What metric am I going to use? I know you touched upon a few of these. Is it the number of citations? And you actually, Anne, you made me think about even further, who were the players around this proposal in the first place to begin with. All of these are things that we can think about very carefully, but the subjectivity of it is what makes me not worry, but think harder a bit about the implementation and making this universal. So if we're looking at I don't know, nursing home data, for example, we really need to make sure that we have implemented the kind of data processing and text mining before we even start topic modeling, to make sure that the data are consistent and in a format that would make absolute sense. A lot of the tools that are available out there work very well for generic terms and literature. And of course, this is getting better every day. So I don't have a definite answer. I just think that this is a hard problem. I also know that advances are being made in packages used for specific fields and domains. Maybe some more than others, like biomedical, definitely. We have a lot more resources available. If it's just for literature of the 18th century, and you can see that I'm speaking out of my domain here, I don't know what it's going to look like. But yeah, the future is optimistic. It's just going to involve a lot of work. And I think the nice part is that the automatable part of it is easier for us to implement now than it has ever been. So the experts and the programmers and the analysts can actually sit together and create tools that are good for them, maybe for the next year. And then after that, it's going to change.
Indeed, yes. Yeah. So right at the beginning of this conversation, when we did our kind of initial first 3 minutes each, Suja, you mentioned ethics. And we haven't come back to ethics for the discussion until now. So I just want to kind of wrap up this thing with a little chat about ethics, because the questions come in as well from the audience about this. So so the question as it's framed from the audience member, the attendee, is with all the talk about personalization and tracking users and so forth, how much do we have to look at privacy concerns, and how do we integrate into our strategy, particularly around things like GDPR and regulatory requirements, which might vary across different jurisdictions. So Suji, you mentioned ethics in your opening talk. So why don't we start with you and tell us a little bit about ethics and big data?
I think it's a very important issue. In terms of my job, I was a victim of GDPR for a good 5 months. While I was very happy to be a victim in this sense, right? the company realized it had to take the GDPR regulations very seriously. And the good message of the company that I was working at the time was that a lot of security and privacy concerns were automatically taken care of. But we had to think through this further, think of who was working with the data and what they were going to be doing with it. In terms of analysis projects and what you want to do with the data, I think this is a fantastic exercise for everyone to go through. It is very time consuming. And I think that is what makes people less amenable to working with these constraints. But I encourage everyone in that situation to think of what it's going to look like downstream. So if a tool has been developed as a public good, we really want to make sure that we are training that tool on the most appropriate and the right kinds of data. It should not be detrimental to anyone in terms of, say, profiling them, but also coming up with the best information that is truly representative of who's using that tool. My demographic and how the tool might give me results may not necessarily be how it was trained. So thinking about all those kinds of things. And this is not just personal demographics, right? It could also be environmental or things related to temperature or humidity and things like this. So what data is being used to train the tool should also be thought of very carefully in the context of where the tool is going to be used and how and who is going to use it.
Excellent. So we're running a little bit low on time, so just quickly for a couple of minutes each. And why don't you go first a little bit on GDPR and concerns around tracking? Well, that must be an issue. That must be something that's talked about at PLOS, I would imagine.
Yes, and thankfully I'm only partially responsible for that. As far as what we do and how we do it comes from a different group. But no, it's been, I mean, there are a lot of limitations around, you try to get through this by opting in, and as Suja said too, being very explicit about how you're going to use data and making sure you have the permission to use data in that way. But I also think you have to be careful about, I think interpretations of GDPR can also vary. So it is, there's a lot of value in the rule. It's there to protect privacy, but sometimes depending on who you are and what you do, you can be interpreting it lightly or very heavily. So we went through a situation where if somebody wants to get removed from PLOS, we will take out comments that they made on blog posts. And like, I am not an attorney, but that seems extreme to me because they publicly made this comment, So I mean, but then I can also see the point. Well, behind the comment is probably an email address and other things that have to be removed. So I mean, I guess my non-answer is that you have to come up with your understanding of the regulation, and you have to understand with what your cost benefit is and how you enforce that regulation. And then I'll stop there. We only have a minute.
All right, Marietta, any concluding thoughts on the ethics of data?
Just the echoing what everyone has said, building in governance and building in, like in our case, it was GDPR also that fed it for our group, was into everything we do for data, having representatives and having a discussion on governance and ethics as part of every step. And we definitely recognize that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we are nearly out of time now, and I've got to hand back to Ben in a matter of seconds. So just to kind of wrap it up, I think we've covered an awful lot of ground, and we've got some really fascinating information. For those of you who are making a note about what's the thing I need to do tomorrow if I'm going to move my company towards a data future, I think the answer that we got from our panelists was, take a look at what you already have, take a look at your numbers, and try and bring everything together, and then ask the question of, what is it that I want to do with this information? What are the questions that I want to ask now and moving towards the future? So with that, I'm going to hand you back to Ben, and he's going to make some closing announcements. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Phil. And thanks so much to the panel for a really engaging discussion. Thanks to all the participants and for your questions. As a reminder of a few things, we're going to send you a post-event evaluation. Definitely would encourage you to provide us some feedback, what you liked, what you didn't, help us determine some future topics for a session like this. And you see here on the screen, we have a couple of upcoming webinars. Our next event is later this month, April 21st. That's a scholarly kitchen webinar entitled Building a Sustainable Research Infrastructure, What Comes Next, sponsored by Scholastica, so please do sign up for that. As a reminder again, today's discussion was recorded, so everyone who registered is going to receive a link to the recording when it's posted. As a new feature of the Ask the Experts sort of panel discussion, you'll also be able to submit additional questions or comments to a C3 community on the SSP website. The panelists will be invited to that community as well. So you'll get more information about that when we send the evaluation and the link. Please do keep the discussion going there. That is it for our session today. Thanks again to everyone for coming out.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, panelists, for being such fonts of knowledge. It's been fantastic. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.